Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another presentation part of our Envisioning Equity series. We thank you for joining us this afternoon. Just a few reminders: we will be recording this presentation where it can then be viewed at a later date. When you have questions, please make sure to drop them in a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. My name is Crichlow, and I'm a graduate intern here at the Office of External Affairs. We thank you again for joining us, and we are looking forward to today's presentation. Before we begin, we want to thank our sponsors. Today was made possible in partnership with the Medical Humanities Program at Baylor University, at the College of Art and Sciences, the Center for Church and Community Impact with the Diana R. Garland School of Social Work, and the Baylor University Office of External Affairs. Before we hear from Dr. Crichlow this afternoon, we want to make sure that we lay a foundation for terms that you might be hearing today. So what are health inequalities or disparities? Health disparities are observed differences in health status between people related to social or demographic factors such as race, gender, income, or geographic region. Health disparities are one way we can measure our progress toward achieving health equity. Health inequities are created when barriers prevent individuals and communities from accessing these conditions and reaching their full potential. They are differences in health that are not only unnecessary and unavoidable, but in addition are considered unfair and unjust. Health equity means that everyone has a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible. This requires removing obstacles to health such as poverty, discrimination, and their consequences, including powerlessness and lack of access to good jobs with fair pay, quality education and housing, safe environments, and healthcare. For the purposes of measurement, health equity means reducing and ultimately eliminating disparities in health and its determinants that adversely affect excluded or marginalized groups. And justice. Social justice is a view that everyone deserves equal rights and opportunities. This includes the right to good health. To assure that everyone has the opportunity to attain their highest level of health, we must address social determinants of health and equity. Today we will be joined by today's presentation will be on medical mistrust, how race impacts practitioners and patients. A conversation exploring the current state and problems of the US healthcare system, how the COVID-19 pandemic has further exacerbated the underlying inequality, and solutions to address and improve healthcare inequality. Today's moderators are Dr. Lauren Barron. She is the inaugural Michael E. DeBakey, Selma DeBakey, and Lois DeBakey Chair for Medical Humanities, Clinical Professor and Director here at Baylor University. We are also joined by Dr. Stephanie Body, Assistant Professor of Church and Community Ministries at the Diana R. Garland School of Social Work here at Baylor University. And with that being said, I would like to introduce Dr. Barron to introduce our speaker for today's presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to be with you again in the middle of what I'm sure is a very busy day. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Renee Crichlow to you all. She earned her bachelor's in biology at the University of California in Santa Cruz, and then went on to get her medical degree at the University of California Davis School of Medicine. And then she completed her residency in family medicine at the Davis Medical Center Department of Family and Community Medicine in Santa Cruz. She has a fellowship with the Society of Teachers of Family Medicine as an emerging leader. She's also had a fellowship with Health and Human Services as a primary care health policy fellow. And she's also completed a fellowship in medical education and clinical epidemiology studies. She's the incoming vice chair for health equity at the Boston University Department of Family Medicine. Recently, she's the endowed chair, the inaugural holder of the McBaird Endowed Chair to Family Medicine and Advocacy and Policy. I could go on and on. I want you to know that she's also has a certificate in crisis leadership in higher education from the Harvard Kennedy School. And she's had multiple visiting professorships, including at Creighton and Mayo, among many others. Her most recent research grant has to do with Pipeline is Policy, a grant from the Society of Teachers of Family Medicine Foundation. And I have heard Dr. Crichlow speak and was so impressed with the way that she was able to articulate and explain issues about matters related to everything from pipeline to institutional racism in medicine. And it's my honor to have her here as a colleague today.
Thank you, Dr. Barron. Appreciate it. And thank you to Baylor for the invitation. And I really am impressed by the work that you guys are doing in this class, and uh, looking forward to the conversation at the end. In the meantime, let's get busy. So today, I was asked to talk about how race impacts practitioners and patients and the medical mistrust that's there. And I think it's really important for us to sort of have an idea of what our role as practitioners is, but also what's shaped us as practitioners in our relationship to our patients, and what are the challenges that race imparts there. So I like poems and I like stories. And this poem by William Stafford is actually a doctor, and it's called The Way It Is. And I want us to sort of get into a place where we start understanding why we're doing what we're doing. It goes, there's a thread you follow. It goes among the things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you're pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it's hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you can do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. He calls it The Way It Is, but I actually, when in my heart, I call it purpose. And for me, I always ask myself, why do I do the work that I'm doing? I love being a family physician. I love working with people to help make our society better. Um, it's my purpose. It's what I need and enjoy to do. And it's also what carries me through in the hard times. We're going to go through some places that are uncomfortable, but we're going to go through it together. And one of the things that I want to be really clear about is one of the biggest reasons I participate in this kind of work is I believe in unconditional love. I love humanity. I love human beings. I love you. And it's one of those things where people are like, how can you love someone you've never met? It's weird. People are like, they're okay with saying people hate people they've never met. But imagine what it would be like if people were able to understand that you can love people you've never met. So what I usually do is put in the chat, I have folks choose one of these words, and it's sort of just, it's your spark today. So choose one. We don't have it in the chat, but choose one of the words there and think about why you're here and what your purpose is around this. So the objectives today, understand the structure of medicine perpetuates distrust. You're going to be able to demonstrate that communication is hindered by the culture of medicine. You were trained not to communicate well with your patients. Sorry. Understand that the burden of trust building is on us. It is critical that we stop putting it on our patients to have them behave the way we want them to. We're going to engage in helping each other, helping our patients. We have to start building that trust. It has to be earned, especially in these times of COVID. We're in a situation where if we don't function together as a society, we will fall apart. We've seen the challenges, and it's been terrifying, and also you've seen some amazing people do amazing things, and that's what I sort of hang my hat on, is that we all have the ability to be that person. So what's some of the things that get in the way? I always think it's important to define what you're talking about. This is one of my definitions of race. Race is a tool that has built many visible and invisible structures that separate us from each other and from many of our patients. This is a tool whose use has deadly consequences. I want to be really clear. I've taught for the last 25 years or so, and in teaching a lot of these situations, one of the things my students will talk about, my learners will say, they'll talk about white guilt. And I say to them this, I said, guilt is useless, and it makes it only about you. We don't need that. I don't need anybody's guilt. It's totally useless. What we need is determination. And determination is when you decide that this is something worth changing. And determination heralds change. It doesn't make change. Determination only helps change happen when it's coupled to action. So that's what we think about. So a lot of folks are like, I didn't cause all these things. Can't we just all just go back to the way it was? Why do we have to deal with this? It's uncomfortable. Well, it is uncomfortable. And as clinicians, we know that a lot of times healing is on the other side of discomfort. And it's really up to us to help guide each other through that. This is a quote that's often attributed to C.S. Lewis, but it's by a guy named Joe Sherman, I believe it is. It says, you can't go back and make a new start, but you can start right now and make a brand new ending. That's the thing I want to get across. That's why I stay hopeful. That's why I believe in unconditional love, is because starting right now, today, we can help make things better for our patients, for ourselves, for all of us. So, more things about race. Yeah, what race isn't? We're gonna approach this in a way that you've never probably approached it before, mostly with family pictures. I have full permission from my son and my family to use these pictures, except for one picture that my son didn't want me to use, but he didn't say explicitly that he couldn't use it. And as his parent, I can sign, yeah, because I'm his guardian. So, person in question has 16 great-great-great-grandparents. One is Asian descent, 7 have some or all African descent, and 9 have some or all European descent. What race is this person? I'll even let you have pictures. So 13 months, this is what this person looked like. 13 years, this is what this person looks like. So think about all the things we are basing on racial categories in medicine. Pulmonary function tests, renal function, pulmonary function, renal function, things like, when to get screened for various issues, when to get screened at a younger age for various cancers. All these kinds of things we base on race. What is race? What is the race of this child? Human is a good answer. So whoever said that, that was good. I heard you. So race has been defined in a lot of different ways. In South Africa, that child would have been called colored up until 1991. Between 1950 and 1991, that child would have been called colored because he was mixed European Black or mixed European Asian. And he's actually mixed European Black and Asian and white. They solved a lot of their problems by just making things very categorical. The entrances were white and non-white. So how have we addressed race? Well, in the United States, we've taken to the court quite a few times to define what race is. There's this gentleman, Mr. Ozawa, in the early part of the last century, had petitioned to be seen as white. And the Supreme Court said no, because they said because scientifically, white is confined to persons of Caucasian race. And for those of you who've heard these stories before, you're just going to sound smarter when you talk about them. But for those of you who haven't, literally, Supreme Court said, scientifically, it's confined to persons of the Caucasian race. So what happened? So a gentleman named Mr. Thind, originally from Punjab area of India, petitioned to be white. He was a naturalized citizen already, and he wanted citizenship. And you could only, and when he went and tried to become declared white, because he said, well, I was born in the Caucasus, I am Caucasian. The Supreme Court then said, you can't use science. They said, Supreme Court told him, no, you're not white. And they said, Caucasian is a scientific term. And the words, and my favorite part is, this is a quote from the decision. The words of the statute are to be interpreted accordance with the understanding of the common man from whom the vocabulary was taken. So this gentleman was told that he wasn't white because he wasn't Caucasian. This Caucasian gentleman was told he wasn't white because it wasn't in the parlance of the common man what they meant as white. So there's consequences to not being white in this country, especially at the time when these folks were petitioning to be citizens. Mr. Thind and many other South Asians had already become US naturalized citizens. They had their citizenship removed. They were denaturalized. He didn't make a lot of friends that day. So in our country, I'll just pick on one state. I'll pick on Alabama because they're not here. And you guys are in Texas. You don't like Bama anyway. At one point, one of the oldest definitions in Alabama was if you had one great grandparent that was Black, you would be considered Black. And then in 1927, they shifted that. They brought in one drop rule. And they said if you had any drop of Black ancestry, you were Black and not white. So you have to understand, these people, there were a lot of folks who were considered white, and their children were, and for generations, they were considered white. And then in 1927, their race changed. So race, when we say it's a social construct, this is the kind of stuff we're talking about. If your race can change based on who's writing what Supreme Court decision, if your race can change based on what the legislature says, is race really a thing? So what isn't race? Race isn't real. It's not real. The consequences of racial designations are real, and they're very real. So as you guys have heard about, and we're not going to get into the details of the numbers, we're going to talk about how this impacts that trust between the practitioner and the patient. So racial disparities are real. They're definitely real. People are like, okay, if racism is not real, why do these people have hypertension more and these people have hypertension less? Why do these people have more diabetes? These people have less diabetes. That's not race. That's the impact of society on your genetics. And racial disparities are the sequela. I love talking to medical folks because sequela is a word I can use and I like, because it talks about the consequences and their bad consequences. Racial disparities are the sequela of societies and the structures of society's influence on individuals and families' social determinants of health, based on their and their ancestors' phenotypic presentation. So because many African-American African-American patients today had ancestors that were African-American who had the structural racism that was present, like Jim Crow laws, like FHA mortgages not being allowed to be given in Black communities, like the GI Bill only going to white soldiers as opposed to all soldiers, including Black soldiers. Those events, those policies have impact on the health of our patients today because they restricted their ancestors' ability to engage in healthy social determinants of health. They restricted where they lived, where they worked, where they played, and where they learned. And those restrictions uniformly put them at a disadvantage for wealth accumulation, a disadvantage for good education, and a disadvantage for, as Dr. Precis said, we're talking about equity and equity and justice are about having the ability to achieve your best health in an equitable manner. And one of the things I think is really critical is that we understand that equity is about putting resources where they're needed the most. Okay. So racial disparities exist because people and their ancestors have been compromised by society based on their phenotypic presentation. So, race and medicine. Where are we today? We're going to start with us. Whenever you're looking to make changes, it's important that we start with ourselves. So we're going to examine just, what have we gone through in order to get where we are? And it's a very common path because you have to do similar things to become a physician. Okay, so most physicians went to a high school that looks a lot like this. Not the 1980s hairstyles, but definitely the racial composition. It is, and how do I know that most physicians went to high schools that had a presentation somewhat like this? It's because most physicians come from white communities, and most physicians actually come from white, relatively well-off communities. The plurality of physicians. That's not everybody. I'm not saying that white people can't be impoverished, but I'm saying that folks who go to schools that look like this have a more likelihood of going to college, greater likelihood of going to medical school. And yes, that was me. And I was a guard, if you're asking. I wasn't a very good guard. So we're going to talk about how the structure of medicine perpetuates distrust. Basically, we go through a very scripted path to get to medical school. You have to do all the tests well, you have to do all the classes well, you have to do all the leadership things well, you have to do all of the international travel and internships and shadowing, you have to do all them all well. And in fact, you have to do them better than other people. Competition is critical. If you're not, one of my good friends, who is a very compassionate clinician, always says, second place is first loser. Competition is bred into our pathway, our academic pathway. Collaboration is encouraged in order to improve so that you can beat other people at other things. Why are you in study groups? So you can do better on your tests. These kinds of things. Very linear thinking. We're laser focused. We're taught to be laser focused in medicine. The structures that we have in place, if you're not laser focused, A, then B, then C, then D, you are incapable of getting through medicine right now. And we're told that we're given a sort of idea that everything is scarce. There's only this many positions that are open at this particular medical school. There's only this many positions that are open in this residency or this fellowship. The competition for scarce resources does not necessarily invite the most collaborative and compassionate working together. We're taught that things are very exclusive. You've earned your place. You've earned your place. It's a meritocracy. If you do the right thing, you'll earn this privilege. And you have to be able to be independent. You have to be everyone has to be a leader. If everyone's a leader, how's that work? And independence is valued over needing another person. It's like we're not taught to say, especially in my generation, we were raised by boomers. And boomers in medicine, you didn't call in sick, you didn't take days off. And as Gen X, we didn't do that either. Thank you, millennials and Gen Z. You're helping us change. We really appreciate it. And hopefully it'll help change a lot of other things too. I always put this picture up because when I was prepping this lecture, one of the things I was thinking about is like all the things we have to do in order to have a good application to get into medical school. One of those things like, doing research and in labs. And honestly, if you don't know people who know how to do that, how do you get to be that person? Um, and then I also chose this picture because it was, I put in laboratory medicine and this came out. And then its label is actually man, woman, coat people. Anyway, it's there to let us know that we have to have access to certain privileged areas in order to get into medical school. A lot of people can't be in the laboratories. They can't be in the laboratories because they don't know the people in order to get there. And they can't be in laboratories because a lot of this work is unpaid. And when you're partly responsible or fully responsible for keeping your family housed, paying rent, the idea of doing, 8 hours a day of unpaid work is not, is frowned upon actually. So college, as I said, most of us who got into medical school, we went to colleges that looked like this because in order to get into a good medical school, you have to go to a good college. And the majority of good colleges are, are predominantly white. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the big reasons you look at how our academic and social structure is coming into place is one of the issues I mentioned earlier. We're talking about the GI Bill after World War II. All the GIs came home, all the GIs fought, all the GIs came home, and only the white GIs were allowed to get things like college paid for, health benefits related to that, accumulating wealth based on your ability to advance your education. During the 1950s was the largest separation of wealth, largest separation of wealth in this country based on race, attributed primarily to the fact that mortgages and college allowed people to basically leap from working class to middle class. It built the middle class, but it built the middle class for white America. And think about it. When you were in college, who were in your classes? Who taught your classes? Who were you mostly taught about? Who'd you live with? Who were your friends? Who were your friends' friends? We have a culture that is delineated by the path that is delineated that we have to walk is almost completely white. I want you to think about this. When was the first time you had a Black professor? Anytime. Was it in college? Mine wasn't in college. Was it in med school? It wasn't until my third year of medical school that I had a Black professor. Think about when, or if. I mean, there's some people, I might be the first Black person that's lectured to them. I'm not joking. It's probably not the case, but especially if you're in this class. It is the water that we swim in. It's how we get socialized. It's how we learn to communicate. It's how we learn to empathize and be compassionate is the folks that we're around, the folks that we're used to. Medical school, same questions. Ask yourself the same questions. But then now ask yourself also, who were the patients? What were you taught that was normal? What was the normal patient? What did they look like? And how were you taught about people that were phenotypically different from you? And again, who taught you about that? We're constantly being acculturated into an environment that sees, and I'm primarily using African American in this, because in our country, that's the largest dichotomy, is white European descent and African American African descent. That is the largest dichotomy that we have. When it comes to health disparities, the largest one we have is Native American indigenous people and pretty much everybody else. But it's mainly because we've occupied their land and restricted their ability to move, care for themselves or their families. And people that make it out of that, it's like lottery winners. So who teaches you about these things? And what are they saying? Residency, my residency, when I finally got to residency, there were more Black people in my residency than probably any other classes I'd ever had. This is folks from Minnesota. They usually don't dress like that. It was a festive evening. So, first 2 years in medical school, preclinical, someone went and tried to figure out how different, how race was mentioned in lecture slides. People talked about biological differences explicitly. Implied was the plurality, was the majority. And only about 4% were saying it was a social construct. This was in 2016 that they gathered this information. I'm hoping that things have gotten better. You never know. Things don't get better unless we make them better. Oh, by the way, some of the studies that people quote are things like Blacks have increased pain tolerance compared to others. The Blacks have thicker skin than others, like physiologically, anatomically, structurally thicker skin. It's not just talking about, ability to withstand, racism. We know these are not true. We know there is no biological basis for race, but it's still in a lot of places being taught in that manner, mostly subtly now, but it's still there. So the medical culture. I realize that not everywhere do they shorten culture into CX, but I did that for a reason, because it's important that we be clear that jargon is not always helpful. It doesn't communicate well, especially to folks who are non-medical, and especially folks who are terrified. When people come to us and they're acutely ill or acutely injured, jargon is makes things more frightening. So we're going to talk about how the medical culture contributes to the decreased communication between practitioners and patients. Where does that come from? Well, we're taught that there's always a right answer. Literally, we're taught that there's a right answer. Because most of our time is spent, multiple choice questions. You narrow it down to two and then, choose the one that looks the best. But there's always a right answer. And being wrong is frowned upon. Being wrong in medicine, in medical school, more than medicine even. It contributes to that whole idea of competition, and the need to always be right is ingrained in us. And then speaking about the standardized test, they did an analysis of the question bank test for step one. And they basically found that the majority of time when they mentioned like African American or Blacks, it was in relationship to things like sexually transmitted diseases, HIV, basically diseases and illnesses that are stigmatized within our society. And we learn more from tests than you can imagine. We learn, the right answers, but we also get indoctrinated into who has certain problems, who has certain illnesses. And the stigma that goes with those illnesses follows the person in question based on their race. Okay, we're also taught to listen to respond, not to hear. And this is a bad habit that medicine teaches us, and it's constantly reinforcing us. And it's gets between us and our patients. The idea that we're always sort of scanning what people are saying and always trying to figure out, what's the next right answer? What's the information that I need to get that next right answer? Or I have the answer. I'm going to wait for them to be quiet so I can tell them the answer. That's not communication. And people, they feel when you're doing that. And they know they don't trust you as much as they don't feel heard. Being heard was one of the leading reasons that people felt that they could trust their doctor. When they do those, amazing surveys, one of the biggest questions, did you feel like your doctor heard you? How many people actually check that? I will tell you this, when I have patients, and I'm a full spectrum family physician, I do inpatient, outpatient, and obstetrics. And when I'm in the room, especially with my outpatient continuity patients, when we start the visit, we set an agenda because that's us working together to plan the visit. It's the two of us working together. Or if there's more people in the family, all of us in the room working together to plan that agenda. Hopefully we get through most of the agenda. If we don't, we make plans for what we're going to do with the other ones. And at the end, I ask my patients, I'll say, did you feel like you were heard today? Do you feel like I understood what you wanted me to understand? And I said, do you feel like you got what you wanted? Ask those two things. Because sometimes the answer to the first one is yes. Sometimes the answer to the second one is no, I didn't feel like I got what I needed or wanted. I'm like, okay, well, let's pull back. Let's talk about it. I want to hear. The first thing you do is starting to build that trust is learn to listen, to hear, not what we're taught to. We're taught to listen, to respond, not to hear. We're taught that you can fix problems. Everything can be fixed. You can solve things, you can fix them. People are there to be fixed. And, what happens to that relationship if that person's not getting better? Think about that. We'll get back to this one too. We go to medical school to fight death. This is literally a sculpture that is on a hospital, which will remain nameless because it has good intentions. Because there is, that is a certain part of what we engage with. But the idea that this is a fight as opposed to life is a journey makes us in medicine come in a very different direction. And if we look at things as a battle, if they don't go the way we want them to go, does that mean the patient fails? Does that mean we fail? And how does that help the relationship? Other things that we're taught. And as I said, the real things I wanted us to be able to get into is understanding have been trained in a manner that is getting between us and our patients. But we have to identify things before we can change them. One of the big ones, evidence trumps experience. I mean, it's especially, in the last 20 years, evidence is, what's the N? Is it a randomized controlled trial? Patient comes to you, they're expressing something that they feel, that's their experience. If you look at them and you're like, well, that can't be possible because the evidence says this, they definitely don't feel heard. And you're invalidating their experience. And a lot of times we don't even mean to. We're just reviewing the facts. Experts have evidence. If you don't have evidence, you're not an expert. The idea that I'm coming here even telling stories and chatting with you about things, there'll be people who are like, well, where were the randomized controlled trials? A lot of these things can't be measured in randomized controlled trials. There's not a meta-analysis that talks about all these things. But we're trained to respect experts because they bring evidence. That's how you know they're experts. National Institute of Health just recently, in the last 2 weeks, came out with a statement basically saying that they are going to be putting equity and racial equity into a lot of their thought when it comes to the studies they choose and the investigators that they're looking at. For a long time, a lot of Black and brown researchers have been submitting things that weren't thought um, well enough to build the evidence because they were based on things that were important to the people they served, but not necessarily important to the people that actually wrote the RFPs and give the grant money. Experts can also have experience, but we in medicine are taught only about evidence. One of my favorites, patient is a subject. We even have it in the writing of our chart format that we do, which is changing. A lot of that is actually changing, I hope. But the SOAP note, the patient's version is, subjective. It's subjective. It may or may not be true. It's subjective. The part that we put in is objective. The patient is subjective. Now think about how that's training you to think about the person that you're going to be in a room with. We say stay objective because the objective is the truth of what happens. It's you know it's accurate. It can be reproduced, and so much of what we put pain in the objective. We put a pain scale in the objective. Um, it it provides a look at a patient as not so much a being and more as of the object, something that can be measured and something that literally can be weighed and measured. Where's the humanity in that? Patients want to feel that humanity. And in medicine, we're often taught that showing humanity is not a good relationship. It's the culture that we were taught and it's culture that our teachers were taught. So, race in medicine, where are we today? Let's talk a little bit about our patients. We talked about how we have come, who we are coming into the room, what we've gone through to come into that room. Now let's thinking about, what is it like today for our patients? So we have people, they've never, African American communities never trusted medicine. And for good reason. It's always interesting. People talk about, oh, broken trust. The trust is broken. The trust was never there. Absolutely never there. In the initial encounters with enslaved peoples in the American medical system, it was basically being treated like livestock. Generations growing through that. The idea that people have grandparents who weren't allowed into various hospitals because of their race. Yes, that's changed, but that was not that long ago. The trust has never been there. Patients know that you're treating them as a subject. They know that you're doing things like writing, drug-seeking behavior. Are they seeking drugs or are they seeking pain relief? What we write matters because it reflects directly what we're thinking. So, who knows what this is? Okay, yeah, good. Yes, you. This is the Tuskegee Airmen. It's one of the amazing group of pilots in World War II that flew they flew fighter planes and they were bomber protection. And they got to be so well known and recognized that bomber crews would ask for them to be their escorts. Want to keep in mind, Tuskegee. This is one of the ways that we remember Tuskegee. The one we remember the most in medicine is the Tuskegee syphilis trials. Tuskegee, Alabama, folks who knew that their patients had syphilis. Patients were enrolled in a trial that lasted 40 years. And the trial was to follow the natural progression of, of syphilis over 40 years. You have to understand that in that 40 years' time, the treatment and cure for syphilis was found and existed and was actually withheld from these people. They were not told that there was a cure for their condition. This is one of the things we all learn about in medical school. And, we didn't even start talking about this maybe in the last 10 years in medical school. You think about the idea that, they went out, they drew blood, they met these people's families. The thing that always got me the most is that they did lumbar punctures on these people multiple times throughout these years. This was not a benign thing. Not only did they let their syphilis go untreated, they engaged in invasive, painful procedures in order to monitor them. People are like, oh, that was a long time ago. Hey, I hate to break it to you. I remember them talking about the Tuskegee syphilis study on 60 Minutes. I remember hearing my parents talk about it when they read about it in the newspapers. It ended in the 70s. For some of you, that's a long time ago. For some of us, it's not that long ago. And people's memories, the fact that they would withhold medication from people, it's very, very, very disheartening. And the thing is, people who had, no part in this, they know about it. They've heard about it, and they hear about it now more than ever. So people who didn't even African Americans who didn't know about Tuskegee's 10 years ago, they've heard about it by now. And one of the things we're running into with vaccinations with our patients is the fact that a lot of our African American patients, they're saying, they're a little hesitant. I want to wait. I want to see how this works out. I want to make sure they're not, experimenting on people. And you can't say to them, oh, that would never happen, because it has and does happen. But, so here's the one where if we were in the classroom, I'd be like, okay, who, anybody know who this is? And there would be at least one person who knows who this is. These are the immortal cells of Henrietta Lacks. She was a woman, a poor Black woman, who was basically dying of cervical cancer. And she went in to be evaluated and treated. And they took some of her cells from her cervix. And without her or her family's permission, they researched on their cells and someone says they attribute over like 70,000 papers related to her cell line. They were found, most human cells, as you guys are aware, they go through a process of apoptosis after at least 5-7 divisions. But her cells just kept going. They could be cultured and maintained. And they've had a massive effect on medicine in this country. HIV/AIDS, HPV, flu, Parkinson's, leukemia. This cell line has been used in so many of the basic science work that has led to a lot of breakthroughs in medicine. And her family didn't find out until, I believe it was the last decade. Their mother's body was used. Yes, it's only the cells, but the fact is, this perpetuates the mistrust that exists. And folks actually defending this perpetuates that mistrust even greater. But the fact that we would see people as someone that we could just take their body parts, yeah, it's just cells, but whatever, still their body parts, and use them as we see fit without their consent or approval is terrifying. And like I said, if there was trust, it would definitely be breaking that trust, but there never has been trust. And it's been because of things like this. So people are like, no, well, that was a long time ago, even though it wasn't, that long ago. And they're like, oh, well, this is now those things, we have IRBs, you have to have consent forms. There's all these kinds of things that would be in the way of that kind of things happening. And the fact is this, is that the mere idea that those things have to exist tells you that that abuse was there. The patients know it, and they feel it. The trust was never there. We have to build that. That was then, this was now. Okay, so evidence trumps experience. So let's go with some evidence. This is one of the studies that I use a lot when I'm doing these kinds of talks because it's so horrible. It's the idea that how you phenotypically appear would impact whether or not or how soon you got pain medication or management. It's, I'm going to be honest, it's horrible. It's horrendous. And a lot of these studies were done by the people in their own emergency departments. They didn't even realize that this was going on. They didn't realize that they were participating in things like declaring, who gets more pain medicine or less pain medicine just based on the race. Studies have been done a million times, not a million. One analysis found something like over 331 articles identified whether race or ethnicity played a factor in disparities in treatment. And this is in treatment, not even diagnosis. 77% of the articles noted significant disparities, especially with medication treatment. And the most frequent one was 73% of the articles spoke about prescription drugs being just significantly disparately given to patients based on their phenotype. And you have to understand, this is not so much, our patients didn't read these studies, our patients experienced the treatment that is being documented in these studies. Every one of these studies had patients in them. Those patients had families. Those patients brought their children to the emergency room with a stomach ache. Those patients are our patients. They have seen disparate treatment between their families and white families. That's the trust barrier that we run into. We have to find a way through there. So it is their lived experience. It's not, they didn't read the studies, it's their lived experience that when they took their children in, there was poor treatment, not intentionally necessarily. I don't think any doctor intentionally wants to do these things. We have fixed judgments that we have put in place based on how we were trained, both in society and in our medical culture. Yeah, that's me. I was cute. But I bring this up because I wanted you to see, actually, I wanted you to see my mom in this. This was my mom when she was in her early 30s. And she, as a Black woman, has been one of my bellwethers for doctor-patient relationships. And talking about listening to respond, not to hear, she will come and tell me about her experiences. And they are very similar to the experiences my patients will tell me about, because as a primary care doctor, one of the things we do often is we send our patients off to on referrals. And one of the biggest complaints I get back from people is like, oh, They weren't listening to me. They didn't hear what I was going to say. They didn't understand me. And it really affects the way we're able to care for our patients, because if they don't feel that we're hearing them, they also don't tell us what we need to know. This is my mother about 10 years ago, and that's her grandson. And when she feels someone hasn't heard her, she won't tell them if she's taking her medication. She won't tell them how she's feeling, but she'll still go to the appointment. It confuses me a great deal. And I will tell you, one of the biggest things that women, Black women of her age appreciate is respect. Everyone appreciates respect, but demonstrated respect. People who walk into a room and call an elder Black woman by their first name and they've never met this woman are actually insulting them. A lot of us were trained that, oh, it's casual, it's relaxed, it's endearing. For quite a few people, it's considered insulting. There was actually a study that was, I think was 5 years ago, talked about the folks who are like, oh yeah, I never wear a white coat and I always call my patients by their first name. Have you asked them if you can call them by their first name? Was it the first thing you did when you walked in the door? Because I tell you what, many patients, if that's the first thing you did when you walked in the door, you've lost them. You've lost them entirely, because the first thing you did was disrespect them. So we're taught we're supposed to fix problems. Okay, well, we fix a lot of our problems by having our patients take their medication. If they didn't take their medication correctly, what do we call them? Non-compliant? Well, I'll tell you what, a lot of studies show, a lot of my interactions with my patients show, they don't want to be treated like guinea pigs. That's a quote. I'm not a guinea pig. They're treating me like a guinea pig. You're like, I'm just adjusting your blood pressure medicine based on, they're like, I don't need you experimenting on me. Quotes. And when they don't take the medicine we want them to take in the way we want to take them, we attribute it to their failing, not our inability to communicate to them why and how we needed them, we wanted them to take it that way. And also, when we talk about non-compliance, have you evaluated what was the barrier getting in the way of this patient taking it? Spending some time to listen to the patient about what their concerns are about the medication, about what their obstacles may be for actually getting the medication, that kind of listening, that builds trust. That's particularly important. Instead, if they're not fixed, they're not compliant. That's not building trust. Oh, that got messed up. There's a right answer. So we're taught so much about, there's a right answer to everything. And if it doesn't fit the evidence that we know or the studies we know, then the patient is confabulating, malingering, somaticizing. It takes on an average 3 to 5 years for the diagnosis of MS, because there's so many fleeting symptoms. Lupus in African American women, one of the most heartfelt stories you'll hear are people who 7, 8 years before they're diagnosed, and all that time reporting suffering to their physicians. The right answer, if it doesn't fit our little matrix, if it can't be a clear answer in a multiple choice test, our culture that we're trained in says that, well, that's not possible. It has to, one of the things that we talk about is watchful waiting. And I'm really very, very clear with the patient. It's like, when we talk about watchful waiting, the important part that I need to do is actually be watching and paying attention. If this blooms into something we can recognize, we can care for you better. So we're in a situation where these are the challenges. And, do we give up? Do we not give up? I believe all of these issues, the structure that we are trained in, the communication style that we are given, I believe it's been contributory to a lot of lack of trust between us and our Black and brown patients. But it's also an opportunity. During the COVID vaccination efforts that we're doing, one of the leading areas of trust that Black and brown patients will talk about is their primary care provider. They will explicitly say that I will get this shot when my primary doctor can give it to me. They explicitly say, I will get this shot if my primary doctor um, tells me that it's okay. And the other one is, I'll get the shot if a white person gets it first. There's been a lot of mistrust. And what I wanted to help you see is that we've created a lot of those barriers. And as I was said before, and I always say again, we are more than capable. Any problem humans create, humans can solve. But we have to have the will, we have to have the determination, and we have to be able to look at ourselves. So many of these lectures we do are about them, the patient, them. What is our role in this? Because it's our responsibility to regain trust that has never been there in the first place. Determination plus action. So where do we go? You can't bring up the quote again that says you can't go back and make a new start, but you can start right now and make a brand new ending. Well, the way I actually like to hear about it the most is Arthur Ashe, who was one of my heroes when I was younger. He was an African American tennis player, for those of you who don't follow tennis or African Americans. He said, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. And that's it. We have to start where we are right now. We can't go back and make society better. We can't go back to the 50s and make the GI Bill or the FHA mortgage happen. We can't go back and say, treat Black and brown people like human beings. We have to start right now. And with lots of different levels. Society, huge. Systems, all of us work in health systems. It's definitely something that we can impact at that level. But the place we can make the greatest difference is with ourselves. As I said before, discomfort, this is uncomfortable. But discomfort points the path to healing. And that's where we need to be going. So what do we do with our, how do we do this? I think that one of the biggest things we do with ourselves is get informed. These lectures, great. The work and readings you're doing, great. You guys read Medical Apartheid and these kinds of things, very important. Tell those stories, spread this. These are two books and one documentary I highly recommend. Cast, Isabel Wilkerson, excellent discussion of how we got to where we are in race in this country. Race, the Power of Illusion, it's a 3-part documentary. If you only watch one, watch The House We Live In, this part. This documentary series has changed every person's lives that I've ever shown it to and taught it with. Very, very powerful. It's on Vimeo for like $3. And then what do we do next? I highly recommend books like Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Brown. First thing we have to do, we have to learn. We have to continue to learn. I'm still learning. We have to listen. We have to listen to hear. And honestly, as physicians, we have to let others lead. We have to use our privilege as physicians to augment their voice, but we have to let others lead. We're not going to solve this by ourselves, but we can be a part of it. So, seems big. This is a paraphrase from the Purkha Votes, a book of sages. And it says, it's always carried me through. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. And Honestly, I believe in this. We can do this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crichlow. The quote that you ended with was a quote you used in a webinar about race and COVID. And I was so enchanted by that quote. That's the reason I reached out to you. And so I'm so glad that you're here today. I feel I'm very convicted as a physician um, about several of the things you said, but I want to introduce my partner, Dr. Stephanie Body, and I'm so glad that that she and I are together teaching this course on disrupting racial disparities in healthcare. Dr. Body got her bachelor's at Johns Hopkins and then her MSW at the School of Social Policy and Practice at the University of Pennsylvania, and her PhD in the same field. And she's particularly interested in the connection of faith and social innovation and faith-based services and all of those things, community-based participatory research. And I learned so much from my social work colleagues. And I want to just say one more thing. I remember the day that I heard a social worker say that we need to find out what's right with patients, not just what's wrong with them. And it stopped my world because it never occurred to me to look for what was right, only to look for what is wrong. So Dr. Body, would you like to present the first question?
Yes, and thank you so very much, Dr. Crichlow. This was a great presentation, really helping us to deconstruct the way we've been thinking about physician and patient relationships and this relationship that's never been there. So your first question starts with equitable access to all things that make good health, including access to healthcare facilities, gyms, parks, grocery stores, adequate jobs, adequate and safe housing, adequate education, etc. Can you talk about how these things are connected and passed on from generation to generation to damage the health of people of color?
Someone is a very quick typist. That would have taken me like an hour and a half to get through the first 3 lines. Yeah, it's a great question. And one of my favorite white papers is from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Did a study of the phrase social determinants of health and how they could engage with policymakers so they could understand it. And I've used one of their phrases ever since then. Social determinants of health are where we live, learn, work, and play. And the thing is, where we live, learn, work, and play in this country has been constricted by the legacies of Jim Crow laws, legacies of redlining. I'm sure you guys have talked about things like that. The legacies of inadequate and unequal public school resources. Where we play, there's less likely to be green spaces in Black and brown communities. The educational base in our country is generally supported by things like property taxes. Property taxes in Black and brown communities are much lower because the property values are much lower. The educational investment is a lot lower. The fact that people who have the ability to support systems like public schools leave because of white flight, that extracts resources from public education. One of I believe Finland is ranked #1 in public in education, K through 12. They don't allow private schools because they're like, oh no, all those resources have to go to help all of us. We don't do this in this country. When we're talking about independence and these kinds of things. The educational system, the wealth accumulation that has not been allowed in this country for Black and brown people. The fact that the majority of our wealth actually comes from our homes in this country. That's where we hold our wealth and our value. And Black and brown people don't and haven't had the opportunities to the access to mortgage and home ownership in the same levels that white communities have. So live, learn, work, and play. The results of where we live and what our education does provides us where we're going to work. And the fact that in our educational system, Black and brown people are uniformly more likely to be the folks that are suspended, repeat suspended, and enter what they call the school to prison pipeline. It's not the pipeline we want to hear when we're talking about medical school. And the thing is, a lot of times it's for offenses that when white students do, they don't get suspended. And repeat suspension is one of the leading causes to enter the school to prison pipeline. So when you look at public schools for a lot of Black and brown communities, it's not a safe haven. It's a place that doesn't provide them the education that allows them to get ahead, and it puts them at risk for punitive measures. So that's a place where there's not a lot of trust also. And then you go through all that. What kind of job can you get if that's your background? What's the likelihood you graduate high school on time? It's less. What's the likelihood that you get into college? It's less. What's the likelihood that you graduate college? Much less. And when you're looking at those things, you also have to remember ACEs, early childhood events, adverse childhood events, ACEs. So things like having someone in your family go to jail, having their basically chaos in your household. And they run through all the different things that adverse childhood events are. When you're in an environment that we have put a disproportionate amount of our Black and brown people in, you will have more ACEs. And ACEs, correlation, causation, whatever, ACEs correlate with poor long-term health outcomes for both you and your family. Even certain things, even graduating high school on time, the longer you keep a woman, any woman, in education, the higher the impact on positive health care for their children. So education is one of the best healthcare things we have. Safe housing environments decrease ACEs. We have all the things in place. We know what's causing these things. And it's not our patients making bad choices. It's the fact that they're not given good choices. That's the challenge. They have to, when they make a good choice, they literally made that choice. It wasn't sitting there for them.
Wow, that's really something to think about. Thank you for that. We have another question about someone is saying that health disparities are real. It's the language we're using to talk about disparities that focus on race. Race seems to be the central matter. And so this question, it's a great question. So many of the proposed interventions, especially cancer screening, are focused on race-specific recommendations. So if race is a social construct, how do we reconcile the idea of identifying patients who need more equitable distribution of the services with the social construct of race?
Okay, that's good. I like that. I stayed up many nights thinking about this. I don't need you to learn about my sleep habits, but yes, so that's a great question. But this is what we have to realize. Race is a proxy for something we don't know, something we haven't investigated. And race is immutable. It's not going to change. Whatever it's a proxy for, it's probably mitigatable. There's something that being this phenotype puts you in an environment, puts you under the stress, puts you in like the dietary history, puts you in an environment where it's more likely that you have toxins around you, these kinds of things. Puts you in an environment where you have more likely to have stresses from ACEs and these kinds of things. It's a proxy for something that we need to investigate closer. We can say, yes, African Americans should get screening earlier, but we're not going to say it's because they're genetically inferior to white people. We're going to say, because people of this phenotype encounter the environment and structure that makes them at greater risk for developing early cancer. Now let's find out what that's proxy for, so we can actually change that. But in the meantime, we can say, yeah, they're at greater risk, but we're not going to say it's because they're in some way, genetically different. They have risk, and their genes are hit with this. We all know that cancer is more than a one hit. It's like, it's not, you can have the gene, but if you don't have those other hits, it's not going to activate into cancer. So yes, racial disparities exist, recommendations based on race to help people and prevent things, great. But be very clear that this is a proxy for something that we have not found. And when we find that and we mitigate that, then maybe we can change those disparities sooner.
Could you please speak to how students can learn more about social determinants of health?
Oh, yeah, sure. Take a lot of classes. So I actually think the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has done a lot of good work around social determinants of health. And, I would Google them, and I would actually, if they still have the paper, you might be able to get the PDF. It's really good. Robert Wood Johnson, Social Determinants of Health, Live, Learn, Work, and Play. It's really good. I did a whole grand rounds with it one time. It was like,
Could you talk some about your research about the pipeline project?
oh yeah, sure. So I have to clarify one thing. It's not research. It's actually what we're doing. And what we're doing, and let me see this. I was showing them how fancy my backgrounds can get. Let me do this real quick. So that's my background. So we started an organization called The Ladder. And The Ladder is we call it a community of purpose, because I don't like the word pipeline. My father was a petroleum engineer, and I know that pipelines are, expensive and leaky. But we were like, we're building a community of purpose, and our purpose is to help each other get to the next level. That's why we called it The Ladder. And its motto is lift as you climb, build as you grow. And we start out in 9 years old, 9 years old and 99 years old. And we meet every second Saturday of the month, and we eat food, and we expose our kids to hands-on healthcare engagement. Yeah, they learn how to use an automatic defibrillator, not a real one. They learn how to do PFTs. They learn where it's interesting because we have 9 years old, middle school, high school, undergrad, medical school, residents, practicing physicians, practicing nurses, practicing pharmacists, and we try to teach intergenerationally. So we do things like we talk about obstetrics, but not mention where babies come from. It's sort of, it gets complicated with that one. All the other ones are a lot easier. But the whole idea is this, is we wanted to give kids a hands-on exposure to healthcare so that folks who were from underrepresented in medicine communities would have the experience of being with doctors, being with medical students, learning from each other how to get from high school to undergrad. We have this thing, we call it cascading mentorship, where basically each one teach one. It's like, as the senior doctors, we mentor the younger folks. And, we have high school students mentoring the middle school students. The college students are, helping the high schoolers decide on, when to get test prep, where to do it, and these kinds of things. The medical students, our URM medical students, they love it. This was in Minnesota, and still where our first branch was. And the students were like, this is the only room in my month where I'm not the only brown person. They're like, it's really about that kind of support to give people just that little, yeah, you can do this. And one of the things we do is during our meals, we talk about different you have two different quotes that we use, like, you know, fall down 7 times, get up 8. You know, you have two hands, one for yourself, another to help another. And you pick one of those quotes and then you tell a story while you're eating, because one of the things we want to do is create that culture. Culture is created by eating food and telling stories. And we want to give those kids an opportunity to learn the kind of resilience and cooperation and collaboration and compassion that you can have and become a doctor. And we just want to, and will they all become doctors? I don't care. I want them to graduate high school on time. That adds like 10 years to their lives. But, you know, we've had people that started out with us in high school. They're in the 4th year of medical school right now. And we had one of our people, I'm very proud of, Dr. Lichi. She started out as a 2nd year medical student. She's now in faculty after a fellowship. She's on faculty at the university. So lift as you climb, build as you grow. It's The Ladder, www.theladdermn.org. Or you can actually put The Ladder and Crichlow into Google, and there'll be some like videos that come up.
That's fantastic. I think Dr. Body has one more question, but I would love to talk to you more about that and see if we could have a ladder in Waco, Texas. That would be amazing. That would be
We're doing it
amazing.
virtually right now. Next meeting
I can
tomorrow.
see that.
Yeah, that's great. Can you say more about lack of real choice or real autonomy as it relates to health outcomes for people of color who lack power and privilege in this country and in other places in the world? I'm thinking about how to overcome patient blaming in order to change the racial and class disparities in healthcare.
Okay, yeah. So that's in the, you know, fix the problem. And, you know, we go into medicine, you're like, going to cure everybody and save the world and make it all better. That was my actual entrance essay. You know, a few more words. But we're in the situation where what you're looking at is, yeah, we put our ego into our patient. We're like, oh, they're not getting better. You know, they should have more willpower. They should do better. When in fact is, like I said, when you look at the live, learn, work, and play, where we can make the biggest difference for our patients is amplifying their voice in policy, you know, making sure that their neighborhoods aren't the places where they do all the toxic dumping, making sure that things like insulin is not $400 a month, you know, making sure that people are housed. You know, I could tell how well my patient was doing by his A1C easy just by asking, are you in a house right now? And if he wasn't, I'm like, I'm not even going to check it today because it's going to be 12 again. So what we've been doing is been fighting poverty with metformin. Don't do that. Stop putting the blame on the patient. Be there for your patient. If they can do one thing different, great. If they need access to resources, see about getting social work and getting the access to resources. We don't blame patients because honestly, when someone does from a very complex, chaotic environment, when they do well with their chronic illnesses, like I said, that's like a lottery winner. They're making choices that it's very expensive to be poor. It's very catastrophic to have multiple chronic disease and go to your doctor and have them blame you for something. Be there for them. Stop looking to cure people. Be there to heal people. Healing people means helping them make the choices that they want to do in their life. Stop looking to cure them. Heal them. Listen to them. Find out what their concerns are. Direct them towards people who might be able to help, and be there for what they can do. They're not there to make you look good. They're not there to make me look good. They're there because they want care. You can't always cure, you can always care, and you can always heal. So then.
Well, thank you. Thank you. That's a powerful way for us to end our time today with you, Dr. Crichlow. So we're going to turn it back over to Carla Batista to close us out today. Thanks
Thank
again.
you so much, you guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you again, Dr. Crichlow, Dr. Body, and Dr. Baring for hosting this wonderful presentation. I definitely learned a lot, and as a public health graduate student, I really encourage everyone to just learn more about social determinants of health and how that that impacts individuals and communities alike. I do want to share with y'all that our next presentation is actually April 16th, and we will be hearing from Dr. Michael Spencer, where he will be presenting a presentation on achieving racial equity and social justice in healthcare, and the importance of interprofessional and community collaboration. And before we leave, I do want to mention that if you are a Baylor ID card holder, you are able to visit a lot of our small businesses around Waco and get a discount. But this is not only beneficial to you, but also to our business owners and our community. We need to all do our part to support local and build wealth for all. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you on April 16th. Thank you and have a good one.